Love the rant on the bank tax. I think you absolutely nailed it, right? It's really going to fall on Canadians when we go to the banks. Well, higher fees, surprise, surprise. But it's not only that, Corey. Yesterday, we saw the government going after banks and insurance companies. Well, what business, what sector, what industry, what type of Canadian are they going to go after next with higher taxes, right? These taxes on certain businesses, these taxes on the so-called wealthy, they're the Trojan horse of politics. They get the tax through the door and then they expand it and expand it, and eventually they tax more and more Canadians. And here's just one other point. I've heard some people say, well, how are you going to pay down the $1 trillion debt? Well, when it comes to deficit reduction, this is little more than silly political posturing. Corey, the way the Trudeau government is spending money left, right, and center, the government would blow through that type of cash in a day. In a day. And one last thing to end my rant. Trudeau talks about the banks and these businesses doing well. You know who's been doing really well during the pandemic? Mr. Trudeau himself, who's pocketed not one, not two, but three pay raises during the pandemic.
Yeah, most of us haven't been enjoying such, speaking his language. I mean, to throw his own words back when he was talking about that, he said, big banks got a windfall. Well, what the hell did you get, Justin? If the rest of us aren't getting raises.
Yeah, no kidding. If you total up the three pandemic pay raises that MPs, our members of parliament, gave to themselves, they range all the way from an extra $10,000 in total for your backbencher, all the way up to more than $20,000 for Trudeau compared to his pre-pandemic salary.
Oh, good work if you can get it. It's something else. So where else to go with this budget? Maybe you got a Coles Notes version to give us here to start things off.
Oh, I absolutely do. So budget 2022. It's another credit card budget from Canada's national credit card government. We're seeing a huge deficit. $52.8 billion, which follows the last 2 years of astronomical deficits of $300 billion plus in 2020, $100 billion plus last year. So another big deficit. What's so frustrating, though, Corey, is that this government has absolutely zero plan on when it's going to balance the budget. The best that this government can give taxpayers is, hey, in 2026, we'll finally bring the deficit down to single-digit billions. That's the best they want to give us. And Corey, I don't even know if we can trust them to meet that target. Remember back in the day, Prime Minister Trudeau said he would balance the budget in 2019, but then he missed that target by $20 billion.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm glad you pointed out, because you can't use that excuse forever. The difference between the pre-pandemic spending budget and our current one. So, I mean, there were some exceptional circumstances in the last couple of years, but that excuse has to go by the wayside. We've got to try and look back to what our normal bar of spending was, and they didn't stay anywhere close to within it.
And Corey, then if you want to call it normal, if we can call it normal, it really wasn't normal. Remember, pre-pandemic, the federal government was spending all-time highs. So in 2018, you had Trudeau spending more than the federal government did during any single year during World War II. And yes, that's even after accounting for inflation and population growth. Now, this year, Trudeau wants to spend about $452 billion. Corey, that's $90 billion more than pre-pandemic. That's $90 billion more than what the government was spending when it was spending all-time highs. So this is another very costly budget. Of course, the pain is being felt today through inflation, and it's going to be felt tomorrow through higher taxes.
Well, so some of the spending initiatives, I mean, they really had a housing focus. It was housing. I see billions of dollars committed over the next 5 or 6 years towards affordable housing. But does it look like this will be effective whatsoever? I started my rant off with it. People who were listening all the way through, no, I don't believe that. But what's the taxpayers' interpretation, Federation?
Yeah, the government wants to tackle affordability with more debt, but trying to fight inflation with more government debt is like trying to put out the fire with a can of gasoline. It's just going to make things worse. Look, this government tries to talk about affordability, and it should care about affordability because Canadians are struggling. Many Canadians can't afford to fuel the car up with gasoline or to put ground beef in their grocery cart. And that's because you have this government that's been spending like crazy for years and raising taxes. But the answer to this inflation problem is not more spending. It's less spending. It's less government deficits, and it's less tax hikes. So we're seeing the government pull us in the wrong direction. We're seeing the government double down on what is really driving this inflation.
So let's get to some of the positive areas. I guess not positive in reality, but what would we like to see? How could the budget be balanced? And of course, there's the thing with the people who are fearful and dependent on government largesse all the time. What would be cut?
Corey, the government could balance its budget within a few years, by 2024, just by bringing spending back to pre-pandemic levels, which were already all-time highs. That's how the government could balance the budget. And with overspending that we've seen from this Trudeau government for years and years and years, finding savings in every single area of the budget should be like finding water in the ocean, right? So we should be seeing across the board savings. But let's even set those aside for now. Here's a few other ones. Of course, leadership has to start at the top. MPs got to stop giving themselves pay raises while the people that they're supposed to represent continue to struggle with revolving government lockdowns, restrictions, higher taxes, you name it. But also, you can't keep giving bureaucrats bigger pay raises. 312,000 federal government bureaucrats got a pay raise during the pandemic. Let's look at equalization. This is a slush fund for some provincial premiers. It continues to go up by $1 billion every single year. Well, of course, the Canadian Taxpayers Federation presented to the Finance Committee a way to phase out equalization in a fair manner over 20 years. Something like that needs to happen. And Corey, just before our segment, I heard you talking about the gun grab and buyback. Now, this is going to be a taxpayer boondoggle. It has every makings of one. This is likely going to cost billions of dollars, but it won't even make Canada safe. And that's because it's going after law-abiding citizens. Corey, I don't know about you, but I can't imagine too many gang members showing up at government offices handing in their guns. No, this is targeting Canadian citizens, law-abiding citizens. It's really not going to do much to address the real threat, which is criminal activity and the illegal flow of guns across the border.
Yeah, and I mean, this is it's like the Liberals can't learn from their own actions. I mean, it was kind of before your time there, but with Alan Rock and the big gun registry of the 90s, and they assured us this is going to cost 20, 30, 40 million dollars. It ended up costing, I believe, $2 billion by the time they scrapped it. And again, it wasn't effective. It didn't reduce crime. It didn't take illegal guns off the street. They're just doing the same thing from a different angle, and it'll be just as effective and just as expensive, I'm afraid.
And Corey, let me talk about two big spending items that really caught my eye in the budget. So even just setting aside all the spending reductions I just named. Number one, $15 billion on what they're calling some type of growth fund. Now, the details aren't really in the budget, but essentially what it smells like is just some corporate welfare slush fund to the tune of $15 billion. But look, this government could even balance the budget of a lemonade stand. I don't trust it to be running around playing investment banker with $15 billion worth of taxpayers' money. If they want to grow the economy, cut out the middleman, just keep that $15 billion in taxpayers' pockets, in families' pockets, in businesses' budgets, and let businesses and families do the rest. The next thing that caught my eye, Corey, is $1 billion to create some type of government agency to be promoting investment and innovation. But Corey, I don't know about you, but doesn't that sound like a bit of an oxymoron? Government agency on innovation?
Yeah, no, that's never been an area of skill. And no government's immune from that. I mean, in Alberta, well, look at our investment in the Keystone. That didn't pay off well. Or going farther back, we went into MagCan, we went into Gainers, we went into Novotel, all these things. If people don't remember, but the Alberta government got into business all over the place, and all of them failed. All of them. Their record was abysmal, and this was a ostensibly conservative government. Now we got the Liberals running around picking winners and losers. I think the only winners are going to be, of course, those guys who accept the subsidies, and the losers will be Canadians as usual.
And the bond fund managers. Don't forget about the bond fund managers because of all the interest charges that taxpayers have to pay. Look, it's a crazy amount of money that is being wasted on interest charges on the government credit card. Every single month, taxpayers have to pay more than $2 billion just on interest charges on the government's credit card. Now, to put that in perspective, that means taxpayers are paying more this year on federal debt interest charges than the Alberta government will spend on healthcare.
Yeah, and that's just money essentially flushed down the toilet, and they're borrowing more. So not only will they add to what we have to pay interest on, but the government, the Bank of Canada, has already been signaling they're going to be raising those interest rates in the years to come too.
I know it seems like a lot of pain for Canadians, and the reason is because you have this government that put itself between a rock and a hard place. Years of easy money policy, massive printing of money on display during the pandemic, and of course, overspending for years from the federal government. So, look, there's just no way to skip out on paying the piper. Eventually, you have to pay the piper. And if you don't believe so, well, then just ask the finance ministers from the 1990s what happens when politicians kick the deficit can down the road for far too long. Remember in the 90s, Corey, you'll remember this. Maybe I won't. But you had these finance ministers from all levels of government, from different political parties, who had to make some very, very, very tough decisions. And what we continue to say now is either this government makes some tough decisions, like bringing spending back to pre-pandemic levels, which were already all-time highs, or tougher decisions are going to be forced on us, just like what happened in Saskatchewan when you had an NDP government that was forced to close more than 50 hospitals across that prairie province.
Well, that's it. I mean, fiscal reality does come home to roost. There's a lot of parts of the 90s I don't remember really well, but I indulged a lot in those days. But I do remember the politics a lot of the time. And yeah, politicians of every stripe had to do it. The Romano NDP government had to balance their budget. Jean Chrétien, a Liberal government, had to balance their budget. And this will eventually come to us. And I mean, it doesn't matter how much the unions scream and how much the left screams, because that's what happens when the cuts come. When the cupboard truly becomes bare, it doesn't matter if it's an NDP government, a Liberal government, they have to cut. And if we'd cut modestly now, it'll save from the drastic cuts later, but not enough people seem to realize that yet.
And I also want to just make it clear, this isn't just consequences for years down the road, right? A lot of people, when they think about government debt, they think of, yeah, there's money being wasted on interest payments and it's too much money. We need that to be going and used to build more hospitals, roads, lower taxes, things of that nature. But we're also seeing real life consequences today. The inflation tax is showing Canadians firsthand that you can't just have government debt running wild. You can't have the government's printing press on overdrive and think that nothing's going to happen. During the pandemic, we saw the federal government central bank, the Bank of Canada, print $370 billion right out of thin air, buying financial assets like Government of Canada debt. And the problem there is the more dollars that this Bank of Canada prints, the less that your dollars in your bank account or in your savings account will buy. So it sure has seemed that Ottawa has been financing a good chunk of its deficits with the printing press, which means that Ottawa has been financing and getting some of its money by devaluing your money. That's the inflation tax, and the debt is having a real world consequence by driving up the cost of living here in Canada.
Yeah, and it's just brutal on people with fixed incomes and such. I mean, you can't flex and move to go with that. I mean, some people can float a bit with inflation. Their salaries will increase a bit, but not everybody's in that position, and it's going to be very harmful. There was also some payroll taxes that rose.
Yep, payroll taxes are up again in 2022. Expect to pay about $400 extra if you're making about $65,000 or more just through payroll taxes. So what really caught the eye in the budget, I think, of the media is the bank and insurance tax. But we also have to remember that taxes are going up this year, even outside of what was really in that budget. And I'm talking about the carbon tax, right? That just went up April 1. Alcohol taxes just went up April 1, and payroll taxes are also going up in 2022.
So was there a couple of taxes they reduced somewhere, just to throw a little credit where due?
Well, yeah, there was, I guess, two types of tax reductions. There was a tax on low alcoholic beer, an excise tax on that, and there should have never been an excise tax on lower non-alcoholic beverages, right? So it's good to see the government scrap that. That's good policy, credit where credit's due. And there was some other tax relief for small businesses. I mean, everyone knows that small businesses need tax relief, especially right now after the last 2 years that governments have put them through. And the government is allowing more businesses, so medium-sized businesses, to be eligible for the small business tax rate, which is lower than the general business tax rate. So those are both, good moves for sure, but not even close to what we need to be seeing from this government on tax relief.
Yeah, no, they are drops in the bucket, and but I guess it's worth mentioning. We're here to cover kind of the whole budget. I mean, the one that gets me is any kind of increase to payroll taxes. I mean, government talks about taxes as being something to stop the activity of something. Well, when you're going to tax people on their employment, you're going to reduce their employment. They don't seem to understand that when it comes.
Yeah, and that's money that they should be leaving in Canadians' pockets. Families are having such a difficult time. Canadians are having such a difficult time, but also that impacts businesses as well. And obviously, businesses need liquidity. They need to have money to reinvest in their operations, get more people back to work. So it should be a no-brainer that right now is the worst possible time to raise taxes. So very unfortunate that Ottawa continues to raise taxes. And Corey, I think it's important to talk about international comparisons here, because we're seeing other countries do the exact opposite. We saw South Korea reduce gas taxes by 20%. We saw both France and Spain reduce electricity taxes. Italy reducing taxes as well. You have India that cut fuel taxes. Poland cut fuel taxes. Sri Lanka cutting taxes. The United Kingdom just announced fuel tax relief. Corey, you even have President Joe Biden down south saying that he is considering big-time gas tax relief. So you have these other countries that are reducing taxes while Ottawa continues to make our lives harder with higher tax bills.
Yeah, we're certainly not going to remain competitive for much longer at that rate. Well, thanks for the update today, Franco. I knew it wasn't going to be all sunshine and lollipops, but we need that realistic breakdown of what we're facing year by year on these things, and hopefully enough people will eventually turn that tide at some point. So where can we find more information on what you do and where people can push back a bit against this ever-increasing tax burden?
Head over to taxpayer.com. Check out our newsroom. Check out the petitions on there. Follow us on Facebook. Just type in Canadian Taxpayers Federation, and you can follow us on Twitter as well. And Corey, thank you so much for having me on today.